Hello and welcome to the second in our tender writing series for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, or SKU. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm recording on, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and extend my respects to the traditional owners of land across Queensland and wherever you are watching from. Today we're going to look at how you can go about structuring your written responses to SKU criteria, as well as some writing tips to help you get your point across as clearly as possible within very tight word limits, and also how you can use evidence to build a stronger argument for your project. Before you sit down to start writing out your tender responses, it's really important that you're across all of the detail of your proposed project and what you need to tell the assessors. So we want to make sure that all of the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions that are possibly relevant are things that you just know or have at the tips of your fingers. You might want to sit down with other members of your project team and sort of quiz each other on these things to make sure you're across it, or just go through some of the sort of regular questions or details that you would expect to have to give in your responses. So think about questions like, what is the project? What jobs will participants be eligible for once they've completed it? How are we addressing barriers? When will we start rolling out the project, and when will we plan to have it finished? Where will we run our training and activities? All of those sorts of things. And it is important to be across all this detail before you sit down to write, because the writing process will be much, much quicker if you can simply rely on your memory for the details, or you know exactly where the documents you need to refer to are, rather than having to scramble to find bits and pieces of information as you go. And this is particularly important if you're settling down to write with a relatively short period before the due date. Now, assessment criteria can be intimidating when we first see them, especially if they're quite wordy or lengthy. But assessment criteria are also giving you a bit of a leg up if you know how to deconstruct them and make use of their component parts, because what the assessment criteria do are they show you what matters to the assessors. And they give you the opportunity to really clearly demonstrate not only that you understand that, but also how what you are offering and what your value add is directly relates to what those priorities are. And since responding to the assessment criteria themselves are the largest part of your assessment writing process, being able to break apart what's needed and then put your information together in a really effective way is incredibly important. So let's look at how you can structure your responses to take the best advantage you can of the selection criteria. Most important thing to remember is that unlike the kind of interesting descriptive writing we learnt to do in schools, responding to selection criteria is all about being really clear, making everything just crystal from the beginning, hitting that key point, supporting it with examples and evidence, making it so that the assessor really doesn't have to do any hard work to figure out what it is you're trying to say. So if we look at a bit of an overview of the SKU criteria, we've got 5 criteria here. You can expect to see a detailed question about each one of these. And you'll also notice that most of these are criteria that are quite common across community projects, not just specific to SKU itself. So there'll always be a question in a grant or tender application about your organisation's viability and its capacity to actually manage the funds and the project type that's being suggested. You'll always have a question about what that's going to look like in practice, and for SKU that means how you'll be meeting individual and community needs and how you'll be assisting participants to overcome barriers to employment. You'll always have a question about the outcomes that you expect or are committing to provide, and there'll always be something about cost or value for money. Now we will look at these in much greater detail in the tender writing workshop, which is session 4 of this series. But in the meantime, you can get a good in-depth look by going to the grant to applying for funding, which is linked on this slide. As an example of what a criterion and response box looks like on the submission portal, we've got the capacity to manage, or criterion 1 page here. You can see that you've got a text box there. It's got 2,800 characters. That comes out to around about 400 words, and we really recommend that you don't try drafting your response here. Instead, draft it in Word or other word processing software. That way you can write as much as you need to get that first draft there, then cut it down to the point where it will fit in this box and paste it over. You'll also notice that there are boxes there for the uploading of your attachments. So thinking about how you might actually go to structure your written response, let's turn to criterion 2, which is servicing community and individual needs. Now, if we look in detail about what that means, we can see that there's a piece about what the need is in the community, the impact that this need is having on the community and its members, the link between what that need is and what you're proposing in your project, and the local support for your project. To make this a bit clearer, let's use an example. So say I'm going to run a Get Set for Work project, or I'm applying for funding to run it. Well, what's the need in the community? It has to be about youth unemployment. So I might mention that youth unemployment is higher in my region than the Queensland average, or other comparable regions socio-demographically. And then to strengthen that, I'm going to add some evidence. So that might be local government area data, or statistical area data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics that shows that young people in my area have higher unemployment than in other areas. In terms of impact on the community, I might talk about how experiencing unemployment early in life has really bad effects on the social and health outcomes of the people who are affected by it, and also how that youth unemployment affects the economic and social well-being of the broader community as well. And I might be looking at evidence from, say, research reports into the long-term effects of youth unemployment to provide some evidence to support my claim there. Linking the project that I'm proposing to the need that I've identified, I would say that my Get Set for Work project is going to reduce the barriers to employment that this cohort of young people experience, and also help them build connections with local employers. And as evidence for that, I might use, say, previous project reports from my organisation's work with young people previously, or provision of training programs previously, that show that my organisation is in a position to do this work effectively. And finally, for local support, I'm going to want the assessor to really clearly see that local employers support my program, and I'm going to evidence that with letters of support from those local employers. So what we suggest you do as you go to draft your responses to all of these selection criteria is that, as mentioned earlier, you do this in a Word or word processing document, so that you can write as a first draft a bit of a brain dump, get all the information that you think you need to there, and then over time you can hone it so that it becomes tight enough to fit in that relatively small character count, but also you can make sure that you've included all the necessary information there. And using something like this map will help you do that. And we do in session 4 in the tender writing workshops, we use a template that we've got that will help you map this out in practice. Of course, writing is a bit of a challenge, so some tips to help you get started. The first thing to do is be really clear on what the criterion you're responding to is asking for. So I would suggest, for example, copy and paste the question from the application portal into your Word document, and then break it down so that every key point is on its own line, and then make sure that in your response you've got some information there that addresses each of those points or lines. As you do that, you'll probably find that you've also included information that isn't relevant, that's not doing any work for you, and you can start taking that out. But I wouldn't suggest trying to hone and edit it as you write your first draft. Instead, get the first draft done, take a break if you can, and then come back and do that honing and polishing later on. As you'll see in our mapping template for your responses, we're all about putting that key message up front. You don't want the assessor to be having to read through several paragraphs and trying to figure out what your key point is. Just make it really easy for them. It is tricky to be as clear and concise as you need to be in these responses while also including all the necessary information. So if you are struggling to balance that, it can be a really good idea to get someone else, especially someone who's not familiar with the project, to read what you've written. And if they can make sense of it and they think you've covered everything in the criteria, well, as long as they're a good reader themselves, that suggests that you're on the right track. And we've also highlighted in the example we just gave the importance of using evidence or examples to back up your claims. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail now. When it comes to using evidence, we do often talk about data, and that is one of the forms of evidence that's really important. But if statistics make you queasy, don't worry, it's not the only bit of evidence or type of evidence that we want to see in applications. So when we're looking at research reports and statistical data, we might be talking about things like demographic information from, say, the census that shows that the target group for your project does live in your local community, or you might use research to show that there's a particular need. You might also use research reports for particular types of interventions or support programs to show why something that you're including as one of your wraparound supports is a good idea and is likely to be beneficial. And in some projects, you can also gather your own statistical data at the start of a project to use to evaluate it at the end. So for example, if you have participants who are often isolated starting your project and you gather some data on their levels of community engagement, and then you do that again at the end, you might see that community engagement has improved over that time, as an example. Now, what other forms of evidence you might like to include? Expert examples and case studies are a really useful way of making clear what it is you intend to do and how it might impact people's lives. So you might get a subject matter expert in, if we go back to my Get Set for Work example, in youth unemployment and life outcomes. We might have a young person that we've been working with who has experienced a project like the one that we're suggesting and can talk to how effective it was and the impact it had on their own lives, for example. Case studies do a similar thing, and it is really important, of course, for using examples or case study to make sure we have the informed consent of participants to do that. But if we do have that informed consent, they can be really powerful. And we can also look at different ways of bringing that information in. So for example, through focus groups or yarning circles, we can collect information, summarize it, and use that again as long as we have participants' consent. Project reports and internal documentation can also be really useful. So you might have noticed when I talked about evidencing my Get Set for Work hypothetical, I talked about having program reports for previous work with young people to show that my organisation does have the capacity and the track record of successful work with that cohort. That's an example of a program report that provides really good evidence in a grant application. And finally, letters of support. So for SKU projects, you need letters of support to evidence certain parts of your application. And then there are areas where they're not mandatory, but they can be really useful. And we'll go through some of those in the workshop in session 4. As a baseline though, you will need letters of support from community organisations that you're partnering with and local employers or industry representatives. And if you're not sure who those important partners are, just go back to session 1. We had a chat about partners there. So when we're thinking about using evidence in our applications and making sure that we're using it well, it can be useful to think about what funders are looking for. And this is that question that we focused on in session 1 as well. We need to show that what we're offering matches up with what the funder intends for the funding they're providing. So if we look, for example, at this comment from a SKU advisory committee member, applicants need to show their connections to the community and to local employers and explain how they'll move people to employment. So we can really clearly break down those types of evidence I just discussed and look at what specifically we might use if this is what we want to show. So we might use research into barriers to employment or effective or ineffective program components. We might use examples from work with the target group that we're focused on. For program reports, we might look at demonstrations of our work outcomes from previous projects or the projects our partner organisations have run. And of course, those letters of support from employers would be invaluable here. Now that is about it for us today, but I do have more resources for you, which I think help expand on a few of the key points that we've looked at in this session. Again, we've got those short videos up on the QCOSS website, and I've highlighted 3 here that I think are particularly relevant when you start to think about how you're going to structure your responses. But your really key resource here is the Department of Trade, Employment and Training's Guide to Applying for Funding. We have linked that previously. If you don't have a copy yet though, or you've lost your copy, it's linked in this slide. That's it for me, and I will see you in the next session.